Hey, welcome to everyone who's here today, and so pleased to see so many of you here, and particularly thank you, Frank, for inviting your book lunch group here, of which I'm also an attendee. And I wanted to, first of all, before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Asia Foundation, because I know a number of you are new here and you don't know about our organization. So I'm just going to tell you a very brief description here. We are a nonprofit international development organization that's committed to improving lives across the dynamic and developing Asia Pacific. Our work across the region is focused on good governance, women's empowerment, gender equality, inclusive economic growth, environment and climate action, and regional international relations. And I also wanted to point out that Tim Coaches is the chair of our board, who's sitting here at the table, and Frank as well as the board member here, and Bill Fuller here is a former president. So I'm. And we work in 20 countries in Asia. Today, we're going to be speaking specifically about Southeast Asia. And let me just go ahead and introduce our two speakers here. I'll start with Tom Parks, who is a longtime resident of Bangkok. I just found out that he's actually been in Thailand for 15 plus years. He is currently in the role of our country representative in Bangkok, and he served previously with the Australian government, which with DFAT focused on international political relations, conflict and security, economic development, and governance across Southeast Asia. I'd also like to introduce Ambassador Scot Marciel of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. That's a mouthful there. So Scott served as a U.S. ambassador in Indonesia from 2010 and through 2013, and a U.S. ambassador to Myanmar from 2016 to 2020. And I might add that I had a chance to meet him along with our board when we actually made a board trip during that period of time. Tim will remember. And we had the opportunity to go to Nepal as well and meet Aung San Suu when we were there. He's recently released a new book also called Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. It's about looking at the ups and downs of critical U.S. relationships in the region and examining the role of ASEAN and China's influence in Southeast Asia. So I'm going to go ahead and let you start, Tom.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Wendy.
I'm sorry, one quick thing.
Oh, yeah.
So sorry. All of you have this sitting on your chair, and so I want to just point this out that we have a big event coming up on October 12th, and we are honoring two individuals who happen to be in the climate space. The thematic of this is about climate. The honoree is Niwat Roykal. We call him Crew T. And he, not only was he a Cheng Tien Distinguished Leadership Award, he is also a Goldman Prize winner. And we're also got a keynote speaker who her name is Charlotte Para, and she is the deputy CEO of Basil's Earth Fund. So we hope that you'll consider looking at it, and we invite you to join us. So take it away, Tom.
Thanks so much. First, let me just say thanks to colleagues here at the Asia Foundation in San Francisco, and also just to say it's a great honor for me to be speaking next to Ambassador Scot Marciel, who is really a leading figure over the last 25 years on U.S. policy and engagement in Southeast Asia. And I've just picked up his book and started reading it, but I highly recommend it to everyone here. So thank you very much.
You're not getting a commission off this, are you?
Absolutely not.
Just a small one. Small one. Okay, good. That's fair.
Great. All right. So I'm going to talk a bit about the book, take about 15 minutes to just give you a quick overview of some of the key themes, and then we'll hand it over to Scott to pick it up from there. Before I begin, I would like to say, though, what I say today is not necessarily the position of the Asia Foundation, and it's important to note that these are my own personal views. So I think it's important. I think we all know Southeast Asia is a region that is rapidly growing. It is a dynamic region. And in many ways, nearly every major power in the world has a key stake in this region. But I think we also know that rising geopolitical tensions over the last 10 years have cast a long shadow over this dynamic region. So fundamentally, the question I'd like to discuss today is, will Southeast Asia's future be shaped by a new US-China Cold War? Next, please. So many officials and experts in the region, especially those outside the region, believe that Southeast Asia will be a crucial front line in a new Cold War, and that this is actually extremely alarming to most Southeast Asian leaders. For nearly 500 years, from the colonial period really through the end of the Cold War in 1991, this region was frequently overwhelmed by much larger and more advanced external forces, leading to loss of control over their economy, collapse of their political systems, and loss of sovereignty in many, many cases. Thailand, of course, where I've been based for the last 15 years, brags that it's the only country to never be colonized, and every other country in the region at some point was under tutelage of a foreign power.
It's just true though, right?
It is true.
Right.
It is true. But Thailand was also under a lot of pressure, and that experience shaped the Thai view on the world even to this day, I would argue. To understand this region, though, it is crucial to understand the weight of this history on the minds of Southeast Asian leaders, and why Southeast Asian leaders are determined not to let it repeat. Next, please. At the 2019 Shangri-La Dialogue, Prime Minister Hsien Loong from Singapore spoke about his concern that the US-China competition would reshape and divide Southeast Asia. He urged US policymakers to resist the temptation to bind the region into bipolar alliances. And he urged Chinese leaders to avoid a mercantilist approach towards the region that would also try to bring those countries to their side. Prime Minister Lee's message can probably be summarized. I think they usefully summarize the views and concerns of many Southeast Asian leaders, which is basically, don't force us to align with you against the other. It will inevitably lead to a renewal of great power divisions and loss of agency for the region. The ICS Yusof Institute, ICS as most of us know it, in Singapore, does a survey every year that looks at the views of Southeast Asian leaders. And over the last 4 years, I did an average of the different views of these two questions, which basically point to the fact that most Southeast Asian leaders are very concerned that the region is becoming an arena of major power competition, and its member states are becoming proxies of a major power, and that economic decoupling, will divide the region into two exclusive blocks. That's an average over 4 years. Next, please. Now, it's actually understandable that Western analysts might have jumped to this conclusion. Periods of great power struggle throughout history have been very dangerous for small and middle powers, especially those that live in the shadow of giants. Two historical examples are important to consider. I'm going to just talk about one of them here today, just for the sake of time. First is the island of Melos in the southern Aegean Sea. During the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 404 BCE, Melos tried to stay out of the conflict between a rising Athens and Sparta by not taking a side. While Melos was too small to threaten either side, it was also a former Spartan colony that happened to be located very close to a collection of Athenian allied islands. And as a result, Athens concluded that it could not permit Melos to be independent in this conflict. In 416 BCE, an Athenian fleet arrived to force the issue with the Melian leaders. During the negotiation, the Melian leaders made their case to be left in peace. But the Athenians, in a very famous phrase, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, argued, "We will not trouble you with long speeches, because you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Melos refused to agree to this, and Athens laid siege shortly after. Within weeks, the island had been captured, and the price for Melos was catastrophic. All fighting age men were put to death, and all women and children were put into slavery. I mention this example because it's actually kind of a foundational story in political science about the profound and enduring sort of lack of agency for small and middle powers throughout history, and why Southeast Asia's example is so interesting and important today. Next, please. Southeast Asia is refusing to choose a side. It is the countries in this region have decided not to align into geopolitical blocs, and they're doing everything they can to avoid being organized in that way. And it's interesting that Southeast Asia does seem to be following a different path. Southeast Asia, of course, is traditionally been very close to China. It is obviously very close geographically and has a long history of integration with China. But as well, during the Cold War, of course, the United States has been a major actor in that region and has had presence and an important role through security, political, and economic means throughout this time. Yet Southeast Asia is avoiding this choice. I would argue also that the strategic positioning is particularly remarkable given the vulnerability of every country in this region if there were a hypothetical military conflict. Unaided, none of these countries would be able to defend themselves in a direct confrontation with China or the United States. So also, while individual countries may lean towards China or may lean towards the United States, the region has not coalesced into opposing blocs as it did during the Cold War. And in fact, in many cases, as we've seen with Myanmar and the Philippines in the last few years, that lean could actually change the other direction in a relatively short period of time. So the region is actually, if you look over the long term, has found some degree of equilibrium in terms of not choosing sides. Next, please. I would argue that there's two factors that are going to allow them to do this, or what you might say is two factors that prevent hegemonic power or hegemonic control in Southeast Asia. The first is agency of Southeast Asian states. There are a lot of examples of how countries in the region can quietly push back on the great powers in ways that are often not well understood or often not sort of discussed more broadly. I'll show you one example of this in a minute. But many countries in the region are very good at hedging between the great powers, hedging in their relationship, never to be too close or too distant from each of the great powers. And as a result, have found ways of creating almost a tradition of diplomacy, which allows them to maintain and manage their relationship with much larger powers. The second, and very closely linked to this, is what I would say is the influx of external partners. The region has been attracting more and more interest and engagement from external powers, not just the US and China, but also Japan, India, various European powers. Australia is an important power, South Korea. And these countries have been steadily increasing their engagement in Southeast Asia to the point now where it actually allows them to have lots of alternative options for partners. I'm not going to go through all the data, but part of what I try to do in the book is to show how actually countries in the region have a whole range of partners they can rely on for either defense procurement, defense cooperation, trade, investment, other areas, so that in many ways, China and the United States are important, but they're in actually a crowded field, sort of middle level in a crowded field of other actors. And that interest from the outside world continues to grow. Next, please. I want to give you one example about agency that I think is quite relevant and interesting, and also links to one of the people that Wendy just mentioned, Kuti. The book tries to look at a couple of examples of how China and its expanding influence in the region has run into some difficulty in trying to get countries in the region to do what it wants. And one example of this is a section of the Mekong River. About 20 years ago, a project was started where basically China, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand agreed that they would clear a section of the Mekong River that went from Yunnan province to Loong to allow 500-ton ships to move through that region. Now, for anybody who's been to that part, and I know Ambassador Marciel has been there, that region is known for large rock formations and rapids that prevent the passage of large ships to go through that area. And so the idea was they wanted more, trade and traffic to be able to go through that area. And so the section between Myanmar and Laos fairly quickly was all of the rapids were blown. So they would do large blasting projects and allow big ships to go through. So that really kind of decimated the local environment, but it did allow ships to move through that area. The project was complicated even further in 2011 when a Chinese ship was attacked by a group of local drug lords. All 10 Chinese sailors on the ship were killed. After that, it became a security project as well, which led to joint patrols between the four countries along that corridor for many years, continuing to this day. But all of this activity, including the joint patrols, stops at the Thai border. From the Thai border at Chiang all the way to Pak Bang, and that whole region that goes along Chiang Rai province of Thailand, there's been no blasting, and the Thais do not permit the joint patrols to go into Thai waters. And they've done this despite significant ongoing pressure from the Chinese over 20 years that has affected both military governments and civilian governments. And in the end, around 2020, a couple of years ago, the Thais finally canceled the project and did not seem to pay any clear price for that sort of intransigence when it came to relations with the Chinese. So this is one, I think, important example of how Thailand and other countries often get their way with China in ways that we don't all altogether understand or observe. Next. So I think in summary, I would argue that if you pull all these pieces together, especially with all of the different elements and all the different new actors and old actors that are just doing more and more in the region, I would argue that we're seeing a picture that looks more like multipolarity than bipolarity. Multipolarity basically meaning that the region is not defined by its competition between the US and China. That's an important part of it, but that there are other actors that complicate the region enough so that governments in the region can actually find alternative options if they are having difficulty with the US or China. And that what that does, of course, is it changes the way that we should look at the region. So I would argue that Southeast Asia, in many ways, had been rapidly diversifying its external partners and moving in this direction for a generation now. If we look at what happened in the aftermath of the Cold War, of course, during the Cold War, Southeast Asia was highly contested. It was one of the front lines, of course, for the hot war of the Cold War. But after that, after 1991, the end of the Third Indo-Chinese conflict, when the famous phrase by Prime Minister Chachai from Thailand, turning battlefields into marketplaces, we had a situation where suddenly the geopolitical environment was benign. China was a rising partner, was not seen as a threat, so countries rapidly deepened their engagement with China. The US started to focus on other regions in many ways, and in many ways sort of lost its focus, as we'll hear a bit more later, on Southeast Asia as a strategic region. So during this time, Southeast Asian countries rapidly diversified their partnerships. They did more on trade and investment with a much broader range of partners, so that today the region is highly diversified in a whole range of different policy areas. And that basically dilutes the leverage of great powers on countries in the region. Next, please. I'm not going to go into this because it's a bit too wonky and we don't have time for it, but I did come up with a framework for understanding what it will take for countries outside the region to successfully compete in Southeast Asia. These 8 different areas, I think, are important sort of aspects for looking at sort of informing countries like Australia or South Korea, how they can be most effective or most, have the most influence in the region over the long term. And part of that is also how they can help the region maintain this direction towards multipolarity. So I'm not going to go into all of these right now, but next slide, please. I will show just a quick ranking of what I thought were the strengths of different countries. So a darkened box is a strength, whereas a white box is not considered a strength. In my view, Japan is the only country that has a strength in every single area. And I've got a chapter on Japan, which talks about why this is so natural for the Japanese to engage in this kind of context. Australia is also very, very effective in this context. India as well, and I'll leave it to you to look through the rest, but happy to discuss any of these different individual countries later. Next, please. All right, just 2 more slides and then I'll hand it over to Scott. 2 issues that I know that he'll have a lot to say, and he does have a lot written in his book about as well. One of the challenges for the United States, and this has been something that's really defined my career working in the region, where I started in Cambodia in 2002 as my first posting to the region, has been the challenge of working on democracy and human rights in Southeast Asia. It is undeniable that the region has been moving largely in the wrong direction for the last 20 years. And there's data, very clear data, that points in that direction. However, at the same time, with the United States and the European Union and how we have focused to a large extent on those issues in the region, often to the detriment of other areas of policy cooperation, that has undermined our influence in the region in a few really important areas and a few key sort of important countries. One of the examples that I give is Cambodia in the book. 20 years ago, when I was in Cambodia, obviously the country was starting to go down this path towards consolidation and authoritarianism of that government, of the Hun Sen government. But at this very same time, there was a doubling down by the US and other Western donors on focusing on those issues only, or largely on those issues. And what was happening basically was that Cambodia, while it was being increasingly isolated from the West, China was becoming a natural partner for it. It's ironic that China has become the go-to partner for Cambodia, because if you know, during the Third Indochina War, China was the main sort of was the one that was most directly confronting the Hun Sen regime. China was the bitter enemy of the Cambodian People's Party at that time. Yet today it's become the closest partner. At that time, Cambodia was seen by and large as not a very important strategic priority. Today, I don't think anybody in the region or any serious analyst would say that it doesn't matter anymore. And so as a result, by focusing primarily and at times exclusively on democracy and human rights, we have in some ways lost the ability to engage with Cambodia on a broader set of strategic issues. Next. And then finally on ASEAN. ASEAN is a flawed organization in many ways, but it is absolutely indispensable for the region. If you go around and talk to Southeast Asian leaders, they will nearly unanimously explain why ASEAN is so crucial to their own positioning in the current geopolitical context, why they're so committed to it. And while they have frustrations, all of them have enormous frustrations with ASEAN, as do we all. It is heavily criticized for good reason on a few key issues. By and large, it works the way that it's intended to work. While ASEAN struggles to find consensus on key big picture issues like the situation in Myanmar, like the South China Sea, in 99% and more cases, ASEAN meetings reach consensus. They find ways to work forward. And there's ways that they've developed to be able to do this on the vast majority of issues. So most of the time, ASEAN works quite well, but it's on these key issues like Myanmar and the South China Sea where it struggles. And we can talk more about that during the discussion. Next, please. So to wrap up, the region is becoming more open, non-aligned, multipolar. This web of cooperation that we're seeing between middle powers is an important part of that. And I think the region is becoming more open for middle powers to shape the future, both middle powers in the region and those outside the region. European powers and others are looking to this area as sort of the future of their engagement. So there's a lot of indicators that the region will continue to be very, very competitive. I'd like to maybe defer the discussion on the US for Scott. But I would also say that China's willingness, in my view, to compete in a crowded space, so long as its core interests are preserved, I think China will be willing to at least tolerate this open, sort of messy, non-aligned Southeast Asian region. That obviously is up for debate, but I think there's a lot of evidence to point to the fact that it's more in China's interest that this region is more open and non-aligned. They can live with that, so long as they think that their interests are preserved. So I will stop there, and we're going a few minutes long.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to everybody for giving me a chance to offer a few thoughts and then pepper Tom with brutal questions. First, it's a really good book. I just finished Tom's book a couple of days ago, and it's really good. And it he wrote a lot of things that I guess were in the back of my mind, but I didn't picture them as clearly as you put them in the book. So I think it's really helpful because it's a different perspective that I hope a lot of policymakers and others will read to think twice. I'm not going to go through my book, but just a couple of things. My book comes at a lot of these issues, but from a very different angle. We end up pretty much in the same place. And so that's why the questions may not be as brutal as they should be. But to go back to a couple of points you made, Tom, on the, after the Vietnam War, particularly after the Cold War, the US did lose the strategic prism through which it looked at Southeast Asia. And so in the words of William Shawcross, the author who wrote the book Sideshow, the US looked at Southeast Asia for many years as a sideshow, even though it was a pretty important part of the world. The focus was on other parts of the world completely, or to the extent it was Asia, it was Japan, and then increasingly China, maybe Korea a little bit. And then in the last decade or so, as the China's rise and growing influence in Southeast Asia sort of re-injected that strategic focus into the US. It re-injected it in a not very healthy way, so that people in Washington began to look at Southeast Asia as this battleground. And you read it in the press, it's a battleground, and who's going to win the prize? China or the US, which is all nonsense. There's no prize out there. But it's easy for people to read about that. And that's why one of the reasons your book is so important, to get people to look at it a different way. I think in Washington, there's certainly plenty of people who understand that, but it's easy, particularly with politics today, pushing everybody to be hard on China. You go out to Southeast Asia, you got to talk about China. And we got to boost our influence to counter China. I can't speak for the Chinese government, but from what I've seen on the ground and from afar, I get the strong sense that the Chinese also are very concerned about limiting US influence, particularly in the countries near its borders. I have very personal experience with my good friend, the former Chinese ambassador in Myanmar, who would do things like say, you shouldn't travel to this part of Myanmar. So of course you immediately get on a plane. But I mean, to get back to Tom's, but I agree very much with the idea that it's too easy to look at these countries as sort of helpless victims that are just sucked up by whatever gravitational pull is strongest, and they're not. They do have agency. You know, all of the countries of Southeast Asia, and I've been to all of them, spent time in all of them. You know, they're proud. They have nationalism. They want to be independent. And so I think that point is maybe people say they recognize it, but in practice, people gloss over it a lot. I think there's a lot of agency there. That said, I think it's also important to remember, and you make this point in your book as well, how diverse the region is. So the form of that agency and so on will vary greatly in practices, the type of hedging. And I'll offer a couple of examples from my experience. I remember when I was in Vietnam 30 years ago now, as we were moving toward normalization, whenever we would go see the foreign ministry people who did talk about China and ask them how relations with China, they always say, oh, they're really good, really good, really good. And we'd say, yeah, how about the South China Sea? And they'd immediately, bristle and start ranting about China. But at one point, one of the officials told me, their goal in the South China Sea in terms of oil and gas drilling was to have basically the equivalent of the United Nations in the South China Sea, per your point, not just having US oil companies, but from wherever to dilute China's influence. The other example has to do with your point about Thailand as the master hedgers who avoided colonization. One of my favorite stories of all time is the former Thai ambassador, first ambassador to Myanmar, then he was ambassador to Washington, Ambassador Wiosan, who told me when we were talking about Myanmar or Burma, he said, you got to understand that Burmese aren't like the Thai. They're very different. And he recounted a conversation with a Burmese general when he had been ambassador there. And they were talking about the colonial period. And the general was making sort of, unpleasant remarks about the Thai. And the ambassador said, well, I said, wait a minute, we're really proud. We were the only Southeast Asian country not to be colonized. And the general said, yeah, you weren't colonized because you gave the foreigners everything they wanted. They wanted to colonize us, but they had to kill us to do it. Now, having lived in Myanmar for 4 years, I can tell you, there's a lot of truth. They're neighbors, and there's some superficial similarities, but the method is very different. To jump to a couple questions to you, Tom. I generally agree with the notion that all these countries have agency in their independence, and that the U.S. strategic goal very much should be supporting that independence and freedom of maneuver rather than trying to, quote, win them over vis-a-vis China. But there is in Washington and sometimes among scholars and others who look at the region, the tendency to say, well, let's write off Cambodia and Laos. Even Bilahari Kausikan, the quite prominent former Singaporean diplomat, who is the most frank person in all of Southeast Asia, said, maybe we should just, cut these guys off from ASEAN. How do you counter that argument that these guys are too far gone?
No, yeah, great question. First, I would contend that while they certainly have been leaning very heavily towards China certainly over the last 10, 15 years, there actually are, if you look at their behavior and if you look at the mechanisms that are driving their policy, there's actually more room for being optimistic. For example, when Cambodia was chair of ASEAN recently, it was Cambodia that was pushing for the U.S. to become a comprehensive strategic partner of ASEAN. That didn't happen before, although it had been discussed, but I thought it was an important shift. There is evidence, I think, that despite problems with the government, I think that the Cambodians do not want to be completely beholden to the Chinese, and they are looking for expanding the route of maneuver. Their best hope, frankly, is from countries like Japan and Australia to some extent, and even India. So I do think that if there will always be difficulty in our relations with the Cambodians, but I think that many U.S. partners are very well placed to give them options. And so maybe the best approach is to allow those partners to continue to provide options to those countries. And so I do think that there's some positive prospects for that. The second is that countries often have internal mechanisms that almost naturally push them to hedge, right? So, for example, Laos, not much is known about Lao internal politics. But one thing that does seem to be clear is that there is a pro-China faction, there's a pro-Thailand faction, and there's a pro-Vietnam faction within the party. And those factions have a sort of equilibrium where one becomes dominant and the others sort of become less dominant, and then it switches, it sort of rotates almost naturally. And that's happened by and large over the past generation. And so when you see a shift in policy, you see that often coincides with a shift in that sort of power center that is running the show. And so that sort of natural sort of element that no Lao official would ever talk about, there actually is a natural inbuilt structural mechanism that helps them hedge a bit more. So that even though their options have been diminished greatly with their debt position right now, there is enough interest and there's enough concern about this within the party that they won't just continue barreling in a certain direction, that they will be pulled back from the edge eventually. So I think that I have more optimism that these countries will matter and they'll have options in the longer term.
I happen to agree with you. That said, I mean, a related concern that I have is what I would call Chinese neocolonialism in Southeast Asia, particularly in the weak states along its border, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, where Chinese companies, some backed by the states, sometimes it's hard to tell, are basically have created enclaves and through payoffs and whatever, basically completely control and almost run these as autonomous colonies. Nobody obviously calls it that, but that's not the whole country. You have parts of Laos where Lao law enforcement officials can't even go into these areas. They're completely controlled by China, the finances, same in parts of Myanmar, Cambodia. And you might say, okay, that's just the price you pay, but how dangerous of a risk is this in your view?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge risk, but the question is, how do countries in the region receive it, right? So, for example, I think it's fairly clear that the Cambodians were very concerned about what was happening in Sihanoukville when all of this Chinese organized crime was setting up shop to run these sort of internet gambling sites from Sihanoukville. So much so that even Beijing seemed to be complicit in Hun Sen cracking down on that practice, and now it's mostly been cleaned out, is my understanding. What's happening in the Lao, these sort of special economic zones and the sort of gambling sort of sites, etc. I think you have to understand the sort of the Lao kind of political economy to get a better sense of why that happens, right? Local officials seem to be benefiting from it, and some are involved, and etc. There's probably a more complex story within the Lao system, but within the Myanmar system, right? On the Burmese border, a lot of these areas are controlled by ethnic armed groups, right? A lot of them are completely off the grid for really for the current junta government, and as a result, these are almost sort of ungoverned areas. Some of them are more complicit by the national capitals, but by and large, I think it's a very messy sort of region. So I wouldn't look at this as encroachment of Chinese interest or presence, because many of these are Chinese actors that are basically have been pushed out of China, is my understanding, right? But it is very dangerous, and there's a lot of concern about it. But that concern is shared by countries in the region, the U.S., and even to some extent Beijing.
I want to have a few more questions, then we'll open it up to questions from everyone else. Your points about the other powers, the so-called other powers, it's not maybe the best term for it, but I think it's a really interesting dynamic. I mean, it's striking to me when I first got to Southeast Asia a long time ago, Japan was still viewed pretty negatively in a lot of countries from war. And that's just flipped. I mean, some of that's just age and time passing, but also the Japanese have worked really hard, invested a lot, kind of quiet diplomacy, not banging their fists on the table at all. And you highlight Japan, I think, as sort of the strongest of these powers. Korea is also gaining tremendous influence. I mean, the Korean culture is just unbelievable. When I got Southeast Asia, it was Hollywood. Now it's Korea, Korea, Korea. Now, whether they can all translate that into more influence more broadly, I think is an open question. India is, you wrote a chapter on India, has been, about to take the leap into doing more in Southeast Asia for as long as I can remember, but hasn't really done it, but potentially is there. One of the interesting points I think that you highlight, and that I certainly have thought a lot about, particularly in funds, is the complementarity sometimes. Because even like Japan is a US ally, but as you point out, it operates with strategic autonomy in Southeast Asia. So the Southeast Asians don't see it as a US proxy for the most part, which is helpful. And I remember it particularly in Myanmar when we were constantly going in and badgering about human rights, because that's what we do. And the Japanese weren't. Well, Japanese were a lot more popular than we were. But I met regularly with the Japanese embassy, and he'd say, "Are you uncomfortable with what we're doing?" I said, "No. It's one of us needs to be able to get in there and talk to people." And I'm all but cut off because it's just the way it is. So learning how to accept and getting policymakers to accept that complementarity rather than, because what we tend to do is say, "Hey, Japan, why aren't you yelling and screaming?" As if one more yelling and screaming person is gonna help. But can you kind of give me your thoughts on that complementarity, and is that a reasonable approach?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And one of the key criticisms that I've heard about my argument is basically, you talk about all of these other powers that are engaging in the region, but they're all US allies or US partners. And so isn't this actually becoming more bipolar? And this is sort of a core argument. The degree of autonomy that they have is a fundamental part of the picture. I think it's incredibly helpful, and I'd be really keen to get your thoughts on Washington more broadly and whether how this is perceived there. But when you look at the way that countries engage, I think Australia is probably the most interesting example. Even though the Japanese are much more open about it, they're very, very careful to criticize, and they have been, for a very long time. The Australians, are arguably much more like-minded. They're much more sort of on board. There seems to be less space between our policies, right? But from where I sat, including as an Australian official advisor within DFAT, I saw an engagement style which was softly and subtly very, very different, right? An approach where they were, engaging with countries like Thailand or Cambodia in ways that would, where there was never quid pro quo in terms of engagement. There was very little sort of pushing hard. There was almost always a raising of points, particularly on democracy and human rights, but a recognizing that, okay, we've made the point, now let's move on to do something else, right? Which often happened very quietly in diplomatic circles. And Australian officials really would never consider making an open statement against the government, for example, either in the country or, et cetera. They was very, very careful about that sort of approach. But key to this, I think, is understanding the Australian mentality about why it engages that way. They think, from their perspective, they don't have a choice, right? They do not have an option. They have so many Australians in Thailand, getting in trouble. They need to be able to have a discussion about a consular case, and they have to do it every week, right? They are heavily affected by drug trade through the region. They see their security directly tied to what happens in Indonesia. And so to them, they don't have the luxury of talking about democracy and human rights, or they'll do it and they believe in it and they certainly share those values, but they have to go on to the next thing. And that there's a level of pragmatism that comes with being a smaller power, and one that is directly connected to the region, which fundamentally shapes their diplomacy and their engagement. And I mean, in my view, they're a natural partner for the United States because they're able to operate, as you said, they're able to get meetings, they're able to engage with groups that are harder for the US to engage with regularly. And, the two of us together are natural complement in many ways.
Yeah. But you make the point in your book that there's the countries, the external powers that will maximize their influence are those that can have a balance between the values, norms approach and the relationship approach. You're not saying, drop the values approach, but just a balance. And actually, in my book, I talk about, we lost a lot of friends in the human rights community by basically saying, Washington still hasn't accepted that it's not 1991 anymore. The Berlin Wall did not just fall, and we were governments around the world are not waking up every morning and saying, "Gee, I wonder what we can do to make America happy today." Right? I'm not saying we don't advocate or push democracy as much as we can. All those, of course, we should, but the way in which we do it has to change. Switching gears, one last question. You also write in the book about you talked about the importance of ASEAN and its consensus approach. Frustrating, and I spent a lot of time in ASEAN meetings, and but essential, and the important role it plays keeping Southeast Asia sort of together, because a fractious Southeast Asia is much more vulnerable. And that's the main reason ASEAN was established, right? Was to, as you put in your book, to sort of discourage great power intervention. But you also talk about how the Myanmar crisis poses really severe challenges to that ASEAN approach. And if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah. So, as you also mentioned in your book, the reason why it's often puzzling to many of us why ASEAN still retains the level of commitment that it does, despite what we see from the outside. I can't tell you how many people have told me that they see ASEAN as broken, dysfunctional, hopelessly slow, etc. But when you realize that core to the beginning of the foundation of ASEAN is that they want choices and decisions shaped by countries in the region, full stop. And to do that, it requires that every country in the region is involved. And that basically what ties them together, they are not a group of like-minded countries, not even close, right? They are extremely diverse, as you argue, right? What ties them together is history and geography. And that history and shared geography and that shared sort of status of being a small or middle power is what defines ASEAN today, and what makes it all quite frustrating for us on the outside as well. The Myanmar case, though, cuts through a lot of this, because the fundamental assumption is that ASEAN countries do not interfere in their neighbors' business because those are domestic concerns. But the current crisis in Burma is breaking through that. Because it does affect other countries. It affects them directly. It affects their politics. It affects their security situation. And as a result, different countries have different responses. Thailand's response, to the frustration of many of us, is the Thais feel they have to be able to talk to the generals in Naypyidaw. And they have no other choice. They have to engage. They have multiple levels of relationships that they're not willing to sacrifice. As a result, they're not willing to allow ASEAN to go barreling forward with more harsh measures against the regime. The Indonesians, on the other hand, are facing a situation where Myanmar is extremely sensitive and controversial in Indonesian politics. And they have a very strong incentive to have a very forceful and affirmative push. And so these two governments are clashing. And so this, as well as with South China Sea and a couple of other examples, show that ASEAN gets stuck. It fundamentally gets stuck in many cases. And I don't think it's going to be able to work through its approach with a 5-point consensus anytime soon. So while ASEAN is crucial for a whole range of reasons, it's not very good at problem solving, especially these big picture strategic problems, right?
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't expect it to.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. Let's open it up to everybody else. Questions? Yes.
Go back to South China Sea. You said, Tom, that what ASEAN countries are doing and trying to balance between China and the US, and not get too committed. But it seems like what China's doing in the South China Sea, sort of a direct challenge to Southeast Asian territorial integrity, especially the countries right on the sea. So how would you describe, well, it feels like ASEAN appears weak in the face of that, maybe because it is, but how would you describe their positioning and how they're choosing to play those issues with China specifically, but also with the US?
Yeah, so this was the original sort of impossible problem for ASEAN, right? In many ways. I think the way that ASEAN has been trying to address it has largely been to, first of all, develop this this negotiation on a code of conduct for the South China Sea to try to minimize the escalation of incidents that happen, right? China, by and large, has been trying to address it bilaterally and has been sort of stymieing any kind of ASEAN progress. And at times, as you probably know, ASEAN unity has been pretty thoroughly discredited because of actions around South China Sea. So particularly the 2012 ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Ministerial Meeting, they could not reach a consensus on an outcome statement because of Cambodia's refusal to agree to criticize China after a number of incidents in the region. I think the best way to understand why ASEAN is struggling so much, and every single ASEAN chair that comes in says, we're going to make a priority to make rapid progress on the code of conduct negotiation, and of course it goes almost nowhere, right? They always say 3 years, right? We hope to have it finished in 3 years, but it never progresses beyond that. Fundamentally, I think that different countries have given up on ASEAN being an effective mechanism for pushing back on it. So they're looking for other ways. The Vietnamese, for example, are making deals with the Indians, with others to try to do exploration in the South China Sea. They're trying to attract maritime security support and vessels and training from Japan, from Korea, from Australia, from others. So Vietnam, instead of relying, they're continuing to push the ASEAN process along, but not expecting very much from it, right? So they're doing what their approach is basically to hedge by bringing all kinds of other actors in, right? That sort of, as you said, the UN to be established in the South China Sea. So they have a whole range of options for how to push back on China if they need to. And then of course the Philippines, the fact that they went to the International Tribunal was largely a reflection of the fact that they had very little confidence that the ASEAN process was going to lead anywhere. So countries will continue to try to push the ASEAN process, but they'll also try everything else they can, right? So it's really a combination of areas. But yeah, this is, while this really was sort of a dagger to the heart of ASEAN unity at a time, right? I think that the countries have learned to kind of live with this particular challenge, and we have not seen a repeat of that incident in 2012 when they couldn't reach a consensus statement. So while it continues to be a problem, I don't think it's as much of a problem now as it was then, in terms of ASEAN unity.
And I just add that I mean, ASEAN's divided in part because you've only got some of the ASEAN members that actually have claims that are affected, and the other ones that don't have claims, whatever they may think, it's like, we're not going to fight this battle. So you have that division. And the other problem is they're all just way too weak to take, none of them can challenge China, and China's a hugely important partner for them. So I think what they're generally trying to do is raise the cost to China as much as they can, reputationally, and others bolstering their own maritime capacity. So they, not to fight China, but to be able to keep track and put ships, when it's Chinese show up with 7 ships, they can at least send a couple ships out there to say, no, that you can't just take this, it's ours. Again, there's no great answer. I think that's the bottom. Yeah.
How do you all see foreign investment and trade with ASEAN as a lever, as a tool to kind of maintain at a minimum the status quo and actually begin to even be a little more influential than that? I mean, US was a member of the TPP and then they backed out the last administration. There might be an opportunity to get back in to TPP. 4 of the ASEAN members are currently in. So it's what, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei. Others might join. But just, it seems like business interests often, do make progress in relations, in international relations. So how do you see that?
Yeah, it's hugely important. I think, pulling out of TPP was a huge strategic mistake. Whatever you think, even if you were neutral on the trade side, strategically it bound us to the region. And so it was a really unfortunate decision. And now the politics don't seem to support us moving ahead on, the domestic politics don't seem to support us. I think the economic area is the Achilles heel of US strategy in Southeast Asia right now. We have a lot of investment. We're still overall the largest foreign investor in Southeast Asia, but the trends haven't been good. And we're absent on the trade side. We haven't been able to really participate effectively on the infrastructure side. So that's a challenge. And the Trump administration tried various things to step up. Biden administration, so far they've been better at announcing things than doing things. So we'll see. But this is where complementarity comes in. Japan is a huge investor, including in infrastructure. Australia, Europeans, others. So I think the countries, again, for your main point in the book, the countries of the region, they don't like relying just on China as a trade partner. As an investor, China's not a huge investor, despite all the publicity. It's a big investor and a growing one. But Japan's bigger, Europe has a lot of investment, US, Korea, increasingly, some Australian investment. So it's really important, and the countries are very, happy to diversify on the business side as much as they can.
I'm sorry, was there someone else? Please go ahead.
Other people. I hope your books are, you got your book for sale here. Can we get one on the way out? So,
Unfortunately, I don't have many copies. So
I look forward to reading it. So a bunch of questions, maybe one on, when you talked about, we brought up Cambodia, Laos, and also the challenges of human rights versus interests versus. I remember I was in Cambodia. I had the DoD policy portfolio for Southeast Asia, Hsien in 17, 18, 19. I was over there actually going down to Ream to check out their Navy base and pretend I didn't know that China was encroaching on their wanted to build a base. But I remember talking like Hun Manet, and there's a palpable like thirst for doing something with the United States. And of course I had to well armed with our talking points, but it just seems like there's so much opportunity to work with countries like Cambodia, Laos at some level. I wonder if your thoughts on what might be those opportunities, in the light of the constraints on human rights, and maybe on the broader, even other countries, you expand that, working with Indonesia, for example.
Right.
I look at Vietnam maybe as a great example of, hey, we got real differences with a lot of their domestic politics, but we can cooperate with them because we're really aligned on national interests. So maybe how can we be more Vietnam-like with our relationships with some of the other countries where our interests are really, aligned in some ways.
Yeah. Great point. I completely agree. Let me give 2 examples. Thailand and Cambodia. Thailand, the defense relationship is the backbone of the relationship, right? And even when things go really off kilter in terms of the political relationship, it's always the defense relationship that gives balance to the relationship, right? And there's good reasons for that. I mean, we have so much history with the Thais. We have so many different exercises and engagements with them, right? Every single Thai general, and you know this, right, has a story of when they were doing training in this or that place in the US. And drawing on that is always a way that the US can kind of pull it back from the brink a bit with the Thais, right? So that's an important, if anything, it's the sort of overemphasis on the defense relationship, which has been the problem with the US and the Thai relations. But that, to the point, maybe is beside the point. Your conversation with Hun Manet is, of course, so interesting, right? Because he's about to become the next prime minister of Cambodia, right? I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to broaden that relationship. And the Vietnam example is a great one. And it's one, frankly, that the Thais often pointed to. You can do all this stuff with the Vietnamese, yet you criticize them for human. Exactly. Exactly. So I think, with countries like Cambodia, there's a lot of I think, opportunity now to, not just for the United States, but for others. And I can tell you for sure that Japan and Australia are doing everything they possibly can to do more with the Cambodians right now, give them options as well on defense cooperation. There's a RAND report that came out 3 years ago, called, I think it's called like the Web of Defense Cooperation, right? That looked at the region, and it compared the Cold War sort of hub and spokes model to today's model, which is much more countries engaging directly with each other across the board. Australia has direct defense cooperation with every ASEAN country, whereas during the Cold War, it was mostly through the United States, right? So that sort of broadening and that web of cooperation has created ballast and has created all kinds of ways for those countries to work with everybody else. But as well, I think the US can become more and more involved. So I'm really optimistic on this. I think it's in the long term, I think it will benefit the US in the region. Yeah.
I just add that, yeah, in my book, I highlight Vietnam as an example where we've all, human rights has been an issue and an irritant in the relationship all along, but we haven't, neither side has let it define the relationship or the relationship. I think the expectations in Thailand are different. And so and on Cambodia, there was a major emotional investment in the 90s, in getting Cambodia to help make Cambodia make the transition to what we hoped was democracy. And we haven't quite forgiven Hun Sen for ruining that great plan. I think our Cambodia policy is really wrong-headed. Not because we're morally wrong, because it's just not effective. Hun Sen and now Hun Manet will have many other choices. And I see that I saw in the news today, we've already slapped sanctions and visa bans. And this is the problem. In Washington, there's so much pressure. Why haven't you done something? I even got into a silly Twitter debate, which I try not to do. On Thailand, is like, well, what's the US going to do about the Thai elections? I said, oh, a hell of a lot we can do. And that, they've got a lot of trade with us. So what, we cut off trade with Thailand? Is that what you're suggesting? I mean, but it's this sort of institutionalized bias that whenever something goes wrong in the world, it's up to us to sort of show our outrage and fix it. Okay, we should speak up and do that sort of thing, but it's when you see that something's not working, maybe, adjust. But you're up against, you were in Washington, you're up against a lot of pressure. Yes,
Choose. I couldn't help but resist asking the question, what was Vietnam thinking when they barred the Barbie movie due to a depiction of the South China Sea?
It's funny, but I wasn't in the Politburo meetings or whatever they decided that, but my guess, they got their domestic political pressures too inside the party. The hardliners like, oh, we can't let this stand.
I agree. I didn't agree with the depiction either, but
no, it's silly, frankly.
The Barbie movie.
Yeah. There may be other reasons to ban a Barbie movie. But I think it was just, nationalist pressures. Nobody wants to be seen as not.
I don't want to waste too much time on this, but I do have a couple of questions. One is, I'm a commercial person. I create companies and they go do things. And I've done deals with the Japanese and the Chinese and in South Asia. And I've had various different experiences. But to me, I would focus a little bit more on what I call on one side, you have this economic colonialism. It's about raw materials, resources. Now, labor can be considered a raw material, as compared to the old world where we really did structure our economic policies towards comparative advantages and the world was flat. Well, I would suggest it's not so flat anymore, to the extent that we passed the IRA, which pumps $360 billion into making stuff here. Okay. And to make stuff here, we're back in the business of finding and locating raw materials. So now we kind of want to get back what we sold the Chinese in terms of chromium and the Congo and things like that. So not to go into this too far. I think that China having spent twice as much as we have on, say, for instance, renewable energy technology, that we're going to do right now in the US, is skewing things such to make things much more nationalistic and much more skewed and not in favor of developing world countries or industrializing countries. Meaning that they're going to get the short end of the stick in terms of access to what they need to improve their economies, because we're going to hold more back now and it's going to be ours and they're going to have to buy it. We're looking at them as new markets, maybe in the same way that we always have, but there's going to be a huge war over natural resources. And that's these are real wars now. You know, you've got to go get it, but you need to. Anyway, and then on top of that, I would throw out something that may be a little bit more controversial, and that is, this is a look back. Everything I'm hearing is kind of a look back. Looking forward, I think it's pretty clear that there's a decent opportunity that sea level is going to rise, and by no small measure. And if so, can you imagine this Southeast Asia, Philippines, for example, suffering a 12-foot rise in sea level? And how are they going to? Would you imagine that then they would work together to figure out where those 100 million people are going to go that live in coastal areas, and that's going to come on in the next 50 years or maybe even sooner? So those two, couple of that.
So Southeast Asia is widely considered one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. I live in southern Bangkok. My neighborhood will be underwater with much lower sea level rise than 12 feet. It's more like 2 meters.
By the time you get to Bangkok this week?
No. Hopefully not. But Thailand is a massive floodplain, right? And so, just 3 feet is going to go in quite a ways. And of course, you've got Indonesia, the Philippines, archipelagic states, etc. I think you're seeing a time right now where the region is really taking net zero very seriously. It's not as existential as it is for the Pacific, right? Where countries are advocating on the global stage. If you don't do something, our country will disappear, right? In Southeast Asia, it's not quite so dire, right? But it is becoming much, much more serious, right? So as a result, Europe, Australia, others are now seeing net zero, the sort of race to net zero, as a primary field of competition, right? So they are lining up support to be able to help countries move in that direction as rapidly as possible. And you've got governments now that are looking for partners. So I see this as a critical area in terms of the geopolitical competition in the region in a positive way, right? I think there's a lot of opportunities for the US and others, but middle powers in particular, those who have something to offer right now in terms of helping countries move in that direction, I think are going to have a lot of benefit from this increasing competition. So I see it as a possibility.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly on that I actually have an article coming out tomorrow on this, that US together with Japan led negotiations with Indonesia on a $20 billion partnership to help Indonesia shift out of coal. Now, obviously, Indonesia is one of the top 10 emitters, so it actually matters. And the Indonesians are very worried, good reason, that the money's not really going to be there. So it's my argument in the article is this is geostrategic as well as climate. I mean, they're both really important. So yeah, there's a lot to do. On the natural resource wars, and then this isn't an area of expertise, but one of the things in Southeast Asia is particularly Indonesia and the Philippines have quite a bit of certain materials, nickel. I think Indonesia's #1 and Philippines might be #2. Some other products, and they're asking to get access under Inflation Reduction Act, and people in Washington are weighing on. And one of the issues is that most of the investment in Indonesia, at least in nickel, is by Chinese companies. And so Washington's like, well, do we want to give access to Chinese companies? My argument is, no, give access to Indonesia. Who cares what company it is? But so there's an opportunity there to help some of our friends and partners in the region benefit from this, but again, it's politics in Washington. I don't know how it's going to play out. Yeah.
Yeah, so as an Australian, I appreciate and agree with the comments you're making about Australia, and particularly the fact that Australia has made the effort to establish direct military relationships with a lot of ASEAN nations. I'm wondering, what's your assessment of the reaction countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia to the Australia, US, UK submarine deal? Is it too far away to be considered an issue? Do they embrace it? Do they think it's unnecessarily disruptive? What was the reaction?
So the reaction was publicly either concern or mixed, I think is probably the best way to put it. Some countries like Indonesia voice concern about a arms race, about nuclearization of the region. Other countries, most countries were just quiet, didn't say really anything. I think privately, a lot of countries felt that they were surprised by it, particularly Indonesia. Indonesia, rightfully, just a week before the announcement, that press conference, that sort of virtual press conference, right, the three heads of state, there was a 2+2 dialogue between Australia and Indonesia, where the foreign minister and the defense minister met their counterparts. And that was perhaps the timing was not very good, because I think the Australians didn't want to share. They probably were under strict instructions. They couldn't say anything. But the fact that they didn't say anything, not even mentioning that there was a major announcement coming, seemed to have blindsided the Indonesians. And from all sources I've heard, that was a huge misstep, right? Now, we have a new government in Australia, of course, right? And I think there's a recognition that AUKUS is a mixed, has a mixed reception in Southeast Asia. That said, I think Australia's position, right, it's unapologetically looking out for its own strategic and security interest, is a defensible position. And I think most Southeast Asian leaders would accept that, so long as it doesn't change the way that Australia engages in the region, right? So I think it was a bump in Australia's relationship with Southeast Asia, but it's, I think Australia can work through that, and it already has for the most part. So I think it's, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think my sense is that in general, countries are warming up to it and to the Quad, where again, you had an initial reaction of, Indonesians in particular get really nervous about any new, security related grouping, particularly if it excludes China, because they prefer inclusive. The Indonesians, everything should be inclusive. Invite everybody to the party and we'll work it out. That's their approach in domestic politics. That's their approach in international affairs. But over time, they seem to have softened in their concern to some extent.
Except for it's appearing on your map early on, and the just now reference to the Quad. There's been no mention of India in this conversation. And do you have anything that you would like to say about that? And as context for that, India is now obviously the most populous country in the world. Its economy is growing 2 or 3 times faster than China's. So it seems to me it needs to be part of this conversation.
Well, you wrote a chapter about it.
India was one of my favorite chapters to write, actually, because I knew so little about the relationship. One of the things that's quite striking about India, as it emerged from its own sort of geopolitical isolation and economic crisis around the end of the Cold War, it was looking for models. And it didn't really see how Europe or the US was a relevant model for it. But it thought that Southeast Asia, East Asia more generally, but particularly Southeast Asia, was an important model for it to sort of engage with, understand, and possibly even emulate. So India's focus on Southeast Asia with the Act East policy has been there for the last 25, 30 years, or actually 35 years now, right? The problem is that interest has not necessarily been reciprocated from the Southeast Asian side. So they see India as an important and big player, but one that's not so relevant for their current challenges, right? India doesn't offer the investment. And India is very closed when it comes to trade, at least compared to the East Asian economies. There are very few opportunities to integrate into an Indian supply chain, right? And so as a result, India, its influence in the region has struggled to some extent because of those constraints, which are just sort of fundamental to sort of India's model of economic growth, right? However, India is becoming much larger. India is becoming a more active defense partner with Vietnam and with other countries in the region. And India, because of its growing size, and in particular, as the entire world, all the great powers and all of the major powers in Europe and the US have been so interested in India in the last couple of years, Southeast Asians are noticing that and are starting to take India more seriously. So there are challenges. Bilahari Kaushik, he has a great quote about India. Basically, it's a continent that we can't ignore. It was kind of, it's there. You know, it's not so much what India gives Southeast Asia. It's about how it pushes back on the Chinese or how it engages with other powers. That's what matters. It's an example. It's a model for Southeast Asia. And that's where the real value is. So I think India will become a big deal, but the Southeast Asians don't necessarily see it that way yet.
Thank you.
Question. You didn't talk that much about Thailand. I was interested in, looks like there's a potential change of government going on. The military is against it, and Thaksin is coming back. Do you have an opinion on what's going to happen? Is the military going to maintain control? Is Thaksin going to go and stir the pot? And how about the man that won the election last time? What do you think is going to happen there?
I guess I can't defer that to you. Going back there tomorrow. It's messy right now. It's really, really messy.
That's the obvious.
Yeah, I know, but that's the starting point. That's the starting point. The election itself, I think, was really good. I mean, obviously, we're all surprised at the outcome. The process was, yes, there's some fundamental problems that are sort of built into the Thai system right now. But by and large, it was a credible election outcome. Problem, of course, is what happens afterwards, right? Which was kind of baked into the constitution that was written under the military government. I haven't read the latest in the last couple of days, but my understanding is that right now that Move Forward Party and PITA have been rejected, and there are cases proceeding against him, etc. That now it's looking like Pheu Thai is likely going to lead the government, possibly with General Prawit, former Deputy Prime Minister Prawit, in that mix, and they would therefore have the votes of the Senate. Right? My fundamental concern is they may be able to find a solution, some sort of prime minister who can get enough votes in the combined Senate and lower house, but that doesn't mean it's going to go well. And it doesn't mean it's going to be that it's going to last. My biggest concern is, particularly if Prawit is in the government, and please keep this within this room if that's okay. I don't think they can avoid massive blowback in terms of protests. So my concern is that Thailand is heading for more political instability, and that Thailand will continue to go through a sort of messy political environment, possibly with short-lived governments, but I don't see another coup on the horizon. And there's been changes. There's been some shifts as well that the palace has made, which make it harder for the military to do a coup. But more than anything, we just have had a coup and sort of quasi-coup government in place for 9 years, and it hasn't fix these problems that it was supposed to fix from the beginning. So even within the conservative establishment in Thailand, I think there's real skepticism that a coup would make sense again. Certainly that's what I hope, but I'm getting a lot of signals that's the case. So my prediction is that they'll find a prime minister in the next couple of weeks. It will probably be either Pheu Thai or Deputy Prime Minister Prawit, but it will be met with ongoing protests probably for months and months, and that Thailand will struggle and suffer as a result of that uncertainty, that continuing uncertainty. This may be what's necessary for Thailand to finally get beyond this struggle, right, between a conservative establishment and a sort of a budding progressive reform movement, right, which we've seen in various capacities for a long time. But I think the next year is probably going to be messy.
I could just add to broaden it out, to zoom out to Southeast Asia. I would argue that this is sort of emblematic of an ongoing and long-term struggle in Southeast Asia. Often publics pushing very hard for change and reform, and an entrenched elite pushing back, sometimes accommodating a little bit, making tactical adjustments, giving a little bit, but still holding power. I mean, I started my career in the Philippines when they overthrew Ferdinand Marcos and people power. Now we have Bongbong Marcos. He was democratically elected. But you have this sort of frustrated younger generation in a lot of places. And in Thailand, it's really interesting because in the late 90s, early 2000s, we saw Thailand as kind of a model of a country that was moving toward democracy, as well as, you know, economically doing very well up till 1998. And then Thaksin kind of became a little too popular and pushed the envelope too far in some ways that were kind of problematic. So he was seen as a threat to the conservative establishment and monarchy. So they used various judicial coups and regular coups to keep him out. And now when Move Forward Party, first the Future Forward Party, now the Move Forward Party becomes a different kind of threat, not related to Thaksin. They've decided, the conservative establishment has decided that Thaksin's the lesser threat. And Phouthai, which was, you know, the arch enemy for so long, is now the lesser threat. So they're, you know, seemingly working with Phouthai. But again, I think it is important to keep in mind that Southeast Asia, you do have pretty, you know, Indonesia's probably come the furthest in terms of the younger generation and reform-minded people being able to push. But even someone like Jokowi, who came to power as a real reformer, and I knew him when he was a mayor and governor, but he still surrounded himself with a lot of the old elite. And a lot of people in the region are frustrated because it's really hard to move that elite power base out of power.
I'm going to have to step in at this moment and let Ambassador Scot Marciel have the last word. If any of you still have more questions, you're happy to speak to both Tom and Scott at our wine reception that we're going to hold in the lobby area when you first came in. It's already set up. I want to thank both the speakers for their very stimulating and engaging deep discussion on Southeast Asia's multipolar future. And I want to thank all of you for coming here. I also want to remind you to take the flyers. We hope you'll come attend our event. It's here in this building in the Julia Morgan Ballroom. And thanks again. And we'll be sending you other things that may be coming down the pike in terms of programming. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Didn't realize I would have the last word, but as a former ambassador, we always think of something. I would say, I mean, you're all here knowing the talk is about Southeast Asia, so I won't tell you how important Southeast Asia is, but it is really important. It's been underappreciated and understudied. If you look at books about Southeast Asia, or like when I was writing my book about U.S. Southeast Asian relations, there's so little. And I haven't read any books that are quite like Tom's in terms of thinking about it in a, it's an easy read. So don't let his reference to political science, you know, deter you. It's a really easy read. It's very clearly written, and it's a very different perspective. And nobody else that I know of has written something like this. So it's really worthwhile to get I think a very well-written and fresh perspective on the region, looking at it from a big strategic picture. So read his book.
Thank you.